Family Names by Rowanix. Franziska von Karma did not usually attend magic shows. In her line of work, there were always matters far more pressing than watching foolish magicians prance about on a clearly rigged stage, conjuring foolish illusions to fool the foolish audience. She made an exception, however, when the magician was Trucy Wright. Trucy was clearly far more adept than most in her trade, her sleight of hand so quick and tricks so flawlessly orchestrated that even Franziska found herself gobsmacked at times, not that she'd admit it whenever her foolish little brother, or his even more foolish pet defence attorney, asked her about it. Even so, Franziska had too much of a busy schedule to make it to all of Trucy's shows, but she made sure to come to this one. The young magician had just been on trial for a murder she didn't commit, had been heckled and verbally abused by a vicious gallery, had been called a witch and a liar on television. Yet now she stood on stage, tall and proud, with a smile as bright as ever, her voice ringing loud and clear as she greeted the cheering audience. There was no twitch in her smile, no waver in her tone giving away the torment that lay beneath. The perfect performer. Franziska usually did not make it a point to cheer with as much frivolity as the rest of the foolish audience, but this time, when the first part of the show ended for intermission, she stood and clapped with the crowd, smiling up at the stage, her heart swelling with pride for her perfect niece. "Auntie Franzi," Trucy greeted when Franziska stepped into her dressing room during the intermission. "I'm so glad you came." Franziska found herself being gripped in a tight embrace. She was never a fan of hugs, possibly because she simply wasn't used to them, but as long as the hugger was Trucy, or Miles, or perhaps a certain spirit medium, she didn't mind all that much. "Of course I came. This is your big debut, is it not?" "Yup," Trucy said, finally releasing her to go back to her dressing table and touch up her makeup before the next act. "Trucy in Grammary Land." And there, without the magic tricks or stage lights or vast audience looking upon her, her smile finally faltered. Franziska's hand moved to her whip. She had no intention of using it, of course, but the leather snapping taut between her hands was always a comfort for her when she was feeling uneasy, and confronting another person about feelings always made her uneasy. "Is everything all right, Trucy?" Trucy plastered a grin on her face. "Of course everything's all right. I'm Trucy Wright, so I'm always all right. Get it?" Franziska vowed one day to murder her brother-in-law. "You were just on trial for murder," she reminded the magician. "I know you got a not guilty verdict in the end, but—" "I'm fine," Trucy assured. "Polly made sure of it. He's very good at making sure people are fine." Franziska thought back to the young attorney with the foolish name Trucy had been using as a prop on stage and wondered about that. For someone who preached about being fine, he had been screaming an awful lot. "And don't be mad at Papa," Trucy continued quickly, mistaking Franziska's hesitation for murderous fury towards her brother. The assumption wasn't particularly unfounded. "I know he didn't visit me in the detention centre or make the prosecution go easy on me or anything, but he explained why, and I know he felt really bad about it." Franziska sniffed, crossing her arms. "Miles Edgeworth is a foolish fool at times, but I believe he made the right call there. If there had been any whisper of foul play in the prosecutor's office, you may have still gotten your not guilty verdict, but you would have been seen as far from innocent in the eyes of the public. You would have found yourself under constant harassment, and this show would have undoubtedly not be happening." Trucy nodded, her face turned to the side and eyes downcast. "I know, I understand all that. I really am fine about the trial, honest." "But something is still troubling you?" Franziska prompted. Trucy gave a slight nod, but didn't say anything, so Franziska took a step closer to her and let her voice soften a little. "You know you can tell me anything, Trucy." True to her role as aunt, Franziska was often the one Trucy turned to for matters she deemed too embarrassing to tell her two male parents about, though Trucy would often call on Maya Fay for help too. The first instance had occurred when a young Trucy had gone wailing to her father's, convinced she was bleeding to death, unaware of the monthly occurrence that afflicted those assigned female at birth, thanks to the country's dysfunctional education system. Grossly unequipped to deal with such matters, Miles had made a frantic call to Franziska, who dropped everything and marched to the rescue after a quick visit to the drugstore. Since then, Trucy had looked to her aunt as a confidant, someone who would help her with all her troubles and keep all her secrets. Franziska was secretly rather proud of the role. "It's just," Trucy began at last. Her voice was wavering slightly, her lip wobbling, so Franziska dutifully turned away, knowing how much Trucy hated it when people saw her upset. She crossed the room, idly examining the bouquets of flowers lining the far wall, and let Trucy speak in her own time. "It's my family," Trucy said, then clarified. My old family, the Grammarys, they weren't very nice people, were they?" Franziska said nothing, and waited for Trucy to continue. "Mr. Rose, I mean, the real Mr. Rose, She swallowed thickly. "I know he's an awful person and what he did was wrong, but I feel like he had a right to be angry for what Granddaddy did to him." Franziska let her hand brush over the bouquet of white flowers and fingered the card that was attached to them. L'amour. "Granddaddy was never really nice, actually. He never told me what happened to my mommy. I remember crying and begging him to, but he just told me she was gone and never coming back, and that was the end of it." Franziska heard Trucy sniffle and pretended like she hadn't. She forced herself not to turn around. It would upset Trucy more if people saw her cry. She'd try harder to bottle up those emotions, and they would burn her up from the inside instead. "And my daddy, my first daddy, he left me, and sometimes I'm glad he did." Her voice cracked at this, and it took all of Franziska's willpower not to go to her. "I feel awful for thinking like that, but he was scary sometimes, and he used to hit Mommy. He never hit me, but sometimes I wonder if he'd stayed, whether he would have." Franziska felt a tightness in her throat and swallowed it down. Memories bubbled up of Miles curled up in his bedroom or crying quietly in the corner, clutching his swollen red cheek. Of flinching every time her papa raised his hand near her, in case this time he'd turn it on her. He never had, but that fear had never really left. "And Uncle Valent tried to frame my first daddy for murder, and then he left me alone too. And Mommy, I don't know. I don't remember her well enough anymore. Maybe she was nice at least." Franziska finally let her hand drop from the bouquet's card. She remembered the name L'amour, remembered overhearing her brother and Phoenix Wright discussing it alongside Trucy's name, and how she'd threatened them with her whip until they told her the full truth. Yes, she knew who this L'amour was, and she didn't hold her in particularly high regard, not when she still had yet to reveal her true self to her children. Flowers just wouldn't cut it, but it wasn't her place to say any of this to Trucy, not when she still held the hope that her mother was a good person. "And I wonder if I should be doing this," Trucy stressed. "This Trucy in Grammary Land, it seems wrong now. If they were such bad people, maybe I should just let the Grammary name be forgotten." Silence fell over the dressing room as Trucy finished her speech. She was sniffling slightly, and when Franziska chanced to peek over her shoulder, she saw that Trucy had her hat tilted down, hiding her face. The hat did nothing to hide the tears slowly dripping from her chin, though. Franziska swallowed, rubbing her thumb across the leather of her whip. She hated having to bring up this topic, but her niece needed her. "Has Miles told you anything about my father?" Trucy glanced up, and Franziska looked away quickly, but not fast enough to miss the redness of her eyes. "Not much," said Trucy. "Daddy's told me more than Papa has. I know he wasn't a nice person." "No, he wasn't," Franziska agreed. It had taken her a long, long time to come to terms with this, that her papa wasn't as perfect as he'd preached, that the way he treated herself and Miles had been anything but fatherly. He may have raised her, clothed her, fed her, bought her gifts when she wanted them, and trained her to be a great prosecutor, but he was never nice. He'd never hugged her, never praised her in any way that mattered. He'd hurt her brother so much. And when he decided Miles and Franziska were too close, too much like real siblings, he'd torn them apart and pitted them against each other. He'd taken away the only real friend Franziska had. Her relationship with Miles was still rocky in places after having to unlearn so many years of brainwashing, but it was better now. She loved her little brother, and she hated her father for what he'd done to him. There's more than one way to make sure someone is forgotten, Trucy, right? She looked back to Trucy, who was gazing up at her, the tear tracks drying on her face. Forgotten. There is? Do you know why I keep the Von Karma name? Said Franziska, even though it is my father's. Trucy shook her head, and Franziska gave her a slow smile. Because he doesn't deserve it. She cracked her whip taut between her fists. It always made her feel strong and confident, like she could conquer anything. Once upon a time, she continued, when people heard the name Von Karma, they'd think of Manfred. They'd think of the foul man who'd use any means necessary to maintain his perfect record, to get a guilty verdict every time, even if it meant sending innocent people to death row. Now, she propped one hand on her hip and held out the other, fingers spread wide, head tilted back, and a smirk on her face. Now they think of me. When people hear Von Karma, they think of Franziska, the prodigy prosecutor who doesn't strive for a perfect, spotless record, but for the true perfection of justice, whether the verdict is guilty or not. When Miles Edgeworth hears the name Von Karma, he thinks not of his abuser, but of his beloved big sister. My brother carries his father's name to see that he is remembered, Franziska finished. I carry my father's name to see that he is forgotten. And you, Trucy Wright, shall do the same. You shall carry the Gramarye name to perfection, and one day, when people hear the name Gramarye, they shall think not of that criminal, dysfunctional, sordid troupe, but of the magnificent magician, Trucy Wright. Franziska's fervour was cut off when Trucy barrelled into her arms. She faltered for a minute, then smiled and held her niece close. Thank you, Trucy said, her voice muffled by Franziska's puffy shirt sleeves. She pulled away and smiled up at her aunt, a real, genuine smile, if a little watery. I will. I'll make sure to be the best Gramarye magician ever. I know you will, said Franziska fondly. You already are. Now, come along. Intermission is almost over and your makeup is a mess. I'll help you fix it. Trucy sat obediently in the chair by the dressing table as Franziska went about fixing the smudged makeup. She was at once reminded of a much younger Trucy, perched on a bed in some hotel in Europe, practically vibrating with excitement as Franziska did her first makeup that wasn't for the stage. She'd begrudgingly allowed the young girl to do her own makeup in return, and had later had to restrain herself from whipping Phoenix Wright to death as he practically rolled on the floor giggling like a madman as soon as he'd seen her face. She'd soon gotten revenge when she allowed Trucy to test her makeup on her fool of a father, and later on Miles. They had looked ridiculous. It was one of her fonder memories. Can I ask you a question, Auntie Franzi? Trucy said. Franziska nodded her affirmation as she rifled through Trucy's makeup bag for mascara. Why do you call Papa your little brother when he's your big brother? Because it annoys him, Franziska said simply. Trucy giggled, then sighed wistfully. I wish I had a big brother to do that to. Franziska's hand clenched around the makeup bag. So Trucy's foolish parents hadn't told her even that much. She forced her voice to remain level. What about that Apollo Justice? He seems quite like the brotherly figure, don't you think? Polly? Said Trucy, blinking in surprise. She tilted her head to the side as she thought about it. Then her face brightened. Yeah, he kind of is. He's always looking after me and making sure I'm okay, and he's so fun to tease. His face gets all blotchy, and his voice goes all loud and squeaky. She started giggling again, and Franziska was pleased to see her in such a happy state once more. He called Daddy Dad by accident once. He was so embarrassed. It was so funny. Franziska smiled softly. The longer Phoenix Wright waited to tell her the truth, the more backlash he'd get. But it seemed that at least Trucy Wright and Apollo Justice would transition into the siblings' role with ease. They even had the same age gap as herself and Miles, come to think of it. A perfect candidate. A knock sounded on the dressing room door, and none other than Apollo Justice himself stepped in. "Hey, Truce, intermission's nearly over, and... Oh, hello, Prosecutor von Karma." Franziska sniffed as she stood and eyed him. Did all defence attorneys have such ridiculous hair? He wasn't much taller than Trucy, which was saying something, as the girl was quite petite, and if she looked close enough, she could see the resemblance between the two siblings. "I'll have none of that foolishness," she said by way of a greeting. If this man was Trucy's brother, that made him something like family too. "You shall address me as Franziska outside of professional settings. Understood?" Apollo blinked at her, mouth hanging slightly open. Yes, Franziska." Franziska nodded approval and turned back to finish off Trucy's makeup. The girl looked like she was trying very hard to hold back laughter. "You know, Truce, Prosecutor Gavin's in the audience," said Apollo once his shock had seemingly faded. "Maybe you could use him as your assistant instead of me. I'm sure the audience would love that." "But you have the best expressions," Trucy insisted, standing once Franziska gave her the affirmation that she'd had finished. "Clavier will just try to act all cool." Why anyone let a man called Piano be a prosecutor was beyond Franziska, but she didn't bring it up, just watched the bickering siblings with amusement until the announcement sounded over the speakers that the performers were needed back on stage. Trucy grabbed Apollo's arm and started dragging him out the door. "Time for Act 2. Come on, little brother." Apollo started spluttering, his face getting red and blotchy, just as Trucy had described. "What? I'm not... If anything, I'm the big brother." His voice was awfully loud and squeaky too. Trucy laughed and turned back to Franziska. "You were right, Auntie Franzi. This is fun." And with that, the two siblings were out of the door, the sounds of their squabbling echoing down the hallway. Franziska smiled to herself as she made her way back to her seat, all the while fiddling with the whip at her belt. She'd put it to use when that foolishly defence attorney returned from his foolishly timed trip to Karain. It was high time her foolish little brother revealed the truth to her perfectly perfect niece. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed. Have a lovely rest of your day.